This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week is the ever-fantastic Kara Shamborski.
Hey.
And a very special guest, Anthony Desiato. Anthony, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to do this.
We are super excited to have you here on the show. I mean, before, we're here to talk about this nice little movie that's coming out. But Anthony, I guess before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and I guess what brings you to comics? What's your favorite comic book right now?
All right. Now, I have to admit that I'm not as current on my reading as I would like to be, but
that's okay.
I did very much enjoy Doomsday Clock. I caught up on that and finished that recently and enjoyed it way more than I expected to when it initially started and we set out on that journey, over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the way everything came together. The role that Superman ended up playing in the whole piece. Superman's my favorite character. So Doomsday Clock is something that, I recently read that I really enjoyed.
Awesome. And I mean, beyond reading comic books, I guess what's your whole deal? You've got a podcast, you've got a movie coming out. Could you tell us a little bit about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So the documentary is called My Comic Shop Country, and that comes out on April 7th on Apple TV and Amazon, and that's been really a years-long journey. I mean, if we really want to go back to the beginning, I worked at my local comic book store, which Kara shopped at, called Alternate Realities, for many years throughout high school and college and law school. And I actually made a documentary about that store about a decade ago, which is kind of crazy. Kara's in that.
Was it really a decade ago? Oh, wow. Yeah. I was in college. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I realized that recently was the summer of 2010 when I made that Alternate Realities documentary. So it's a decade. It's kind of crazy. But so that was my first attempt at filmmaking. And, I told this story about my local shop. And then 5 years ago, that store closed. And so I started a podcast. Yes. So, I know. We're still not over it.
Never forget.
I know. Never. But so I started a podcast called My Comic Shop History, which is still going. But it started by chronicling the closing of Alternate Realities. And then we expanded and we've covered comic conventions and collecting and stores across the country. So we did that in podcast form and now in documentary form. So that's what I've been up to over these past few years.
Holy smokes.
That's a lot.
5 years ago. Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, honestly, it's so funny. This show started about 5 years ago, so it's really funny that, like, I feel like I've noticed that about a bunch of shows. That's not even related to today's topic or whatever we're going to talk about. But, no, we saw a little bit of the sizzle reel that you sent over to us about this show and this documentary. And man, oh man, I love the fact that, like, you got to talk to all these different comic shop owners from across the country. I mean, that's a perspective that I feel like people on the internet, we speculate a lot about, like, oh, this is what comic book shops are like, this is what all this stuff is. But to actually have you go out and talk to these people and actually get their opinions on things and help them, like, understand what it's like to be a comic shop owner, that's mind blowing. I mean, I'm always really curious about it as a big comic book fan myself. But yeah, I guess what got you into saying, I'm going to make a documentary about this? You said you went to law school. What made you, I guess, switch over and try to make a documentary on top of, being a lawyer? I don't know where that ended you up with.
So I am attorney by training, but not by practice. I'm the director of admissions at the law school that I attend. So, but it was back when I was in law school that I decided to make that first documentary about my local comic shop, and it stemmed really, I guess, from two things. One was, I didn't necessarily love the study of law, and I was kind of looking for a creative outlet over my first summer break during law school. And then the other aspect was just, I enjoyed my experience shopping and working at Alternate Reality so much. It was a never-ending source of inspiration and entertainment for me. So it just led to this idea of, like, well, what if I made a documentary about this store and this community that I know so well and kind of try to take viewers into this little world that we've created for ourselves. So that's really where it started. And then in the process of that, I mean, I really fell in love with the art of documentary filmmaking and telling a story in that way. So that was kind of the birth of that. And then with the podcast, it was a similar type of thing. Once the store was closing, like, I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. And I didn't really feel like I wanted to do another documentary about the same store, but I was like, I have to do something. And the podcast, like, could not have been the better vehicle, because it just allowed us to like really, tell more of our anecdotes, all these stories about the shop. I was able to incorporate so many people. So that was, that's how those particular projects kind of came to be.
Gotcha. And this all then led to my comic shop country, which is just a documentary about talking to other comic shops. Then just you're going in and asking them, why do you run this comic book shop? Or I guess what's the high level premise of it?
Yeah. So, and again, so it started with the podcast, and, once I was done talking about my shop, it was sort of like, what comes next? And, along the way, the thought had dawned on me, well, I could go to other shops, and people had suggested going to other shops. And for a little while, I was kind of resistant because I felt like, I was able to tell AR's story because that was my store and I had this deep personal connection to it. But would I have the interest, to go to other stores? Would I have the ability to tell their story when I'm not coming at it from the inside? So there were a couple of things that kind of held me back. But then I got to the point where I was like, no, I think this is where to go. And it was like I had lost my store and my community. And so it was basically this idea of like, well, could I try to find this somewhere else? And I'm so glad that, I went for it. And, first with the podcast and then with the documentary. So, yeah, I mean, the film explores the business, the culture, and the fandom of, about 20 comic shops from coast to coast. It's not a series of profiles or anything like that. I mean, it's really about shops generally. You get to see the how each store kind of has its different flavors, different specialty, and really I think what unites all of them, probably some of the challenges inherent to the comics industry. That's something that a lot of them share, but on a on a more positive note, really this sense of community and the fact that they are these places for people to go. And, for any of, and I'm sure people listening to this podcast, like if you're a comic book fan, you probably have or have had, a comic shop experience at some point in your journey that has meant something to you, where it's been a part of your routine. It's been a place where you could go and share your passion with other people where maybe you don't have that opportunity anywhere else in your life. So, that's really the heart of the movie. So yes, we go behind the scenes, we show you, breaking down a shipment and, what the Wednesdays are like at a comic shop and all of that. But, really,
nice.
Yeah, I mean, really at its heart, it's about these communities that have formed.
I'm so curious.
That's fantastic. How
did you go about choosing the stores that you visited for this documentary?
That is a great question. So that was a mix. So I knew at the start that it was a mix of the creative and the logistical, to be honest. So I knew at the start that I wanted to have a variety of stores in terms of area of the country. Like it's called My Comic Shop Country. So we have to go from coast to coast. So that, that was in my head from the start. But I wanted a variety in terms of geography, duration, and then again, just sort of, specialty. So that was part of it. And then, it was a matter of, this was a very independent production. So it was sort of like, where can I get to, realistically? And right. there were a couple of places I was able to go because I actually had a work trip and I was able to piggyback some filming onto that. So that happened there. And then, and as far as how I just found the stores generally, for the most part, there were some I either knew or knew of already. A number were referred to me by people, whose opinion, I trust. And then, probably a couple of instances of just sort of being like, okay, I know I'm going to be in this place. Let me see which stores are there. So it was very much a mix as far as how it came together. But that overall aim was really trying to present as much of a cross section as possible. And as far as the number of stores, that was kind of interesting because I felt like, for purposes of the film, there's a little element of spectacle. Like you want to be able to show like, hey, we went to all of these stores, but at the same time, it wasn't a volume game for me either. I mean, I really think, it's not just a matter of, we have so many stores. It's, what we're able to show within each of them. But that was a little bit of the thinking behind the various shop selections.
Okay. And I must know, how many of the shops did you visit had either female owners or female employees, or even like a regular female clientele that you noticed?
Oh, I don't have a hard number offhand, but I would say at least half a dozen, I want to say, about half a dozen.
Okay.
Yeah, there were even actually a couple of more that I visited with a podcast that I did not have the chance to go back to with the documentary. So if you include that, yeah, definitely about half a dozen. And there are a number of husband and wife teams, which was interesting.
Okay.
Oh, really? I mean, that kind of doesn't surprise me with when it comes to comic book shops, like being like a family-owned business in a way, where you kind of have to invest everything into it. Because from what I gather, like just from the sizzle reel and even the trailer that's available like on YouTube, I think the first thing someone says is like, "Don't do this. Don't open a comic book shop."
Yeah.
I mean, and that's kind of one of the questions I was curious about, how many of these people had as comic shop owners, did they have like positive experiences in saying like, oh, this is a business that I can live by okay? Or did you find that there were like trends where more and more comic shops were turning to like gaming or like major releases of like Magic the Gathering or something like that in order to supplement some of the comic like sales and stuff? Or was it everything was just strictly comic books with only a handful that were selling games and stuff based on what you experienced?
No, it was definitely a mix. And that actually is a little bit of a debate in the movie. And that's a segment of the movie in particular. I'm especially proud of how that came out. And sort of Funko Pops represent that debate in the movie. They're kind of like the lightning rod that the stores kind of go back and forth over. And I'm a collector of the Funko Pops, but I know, and I mean, you'll see this in the movie. I mean, there are a number of shops who are adamant, like they don't want to carry those sorts of things. They pride themselves on being more of an old school shop. They're really just focused on comics and trade paperbacks. And then you have, the newer breed of stores that have embraced Funko Pops and gaming and apparel and a more diversified product line. And you do kind of have this split, and it's interesting. Like I get both perspectives. I certainly understand if you have an idea of what a comic shop should be, and especially if you've been doing this for a really long time, it can be hard to sort of embrace these other product lines. So that was actually very interesting. But yeah, you do see a mix in the movie as far as stores that are those more old school shops and the newer breed.
Did you happen to notice, obviously, like you mentioned, this is like super anecdotally, this is by no means a comprehensive overview of all the comic shops in the US, but we're curious about like if people around the country have like different reading habits based on the region that they're in, or maybe like city shops being different than more suburban shops in terms of what they're selling. And like you said, some shops are selling like just the comics and some are diversifying their merchandise a little bit. So any kind of overall trends you were noticing?
Yeah, that is very interesting. And so, I mean, the short answer is generally no, but again, that's not to say that it's not happening, but just in terms of what I saw, that's very interesting, because when I started this, I kind of thought that the geography would play a little bit more of a role in terms of what I was seeing at the stores and then what was ultimately, captured in the documentary. And you definitely see variety. Different stores are laid out differently and they have different aesthetics and different atmospheres and they carry different things. But from what I could tell, and again, this might just be something that I wasn't aware of or went over my head. I don't know. But there wasn't really much that I could pinpoint specifically as being like, oh, they do this because they're in this part of the country.
Mm-hmm. You're telling me that DC moved out to California for no reason. Is that what I'm hearing?
But that, again, just from what I was observing. So I'm sure there are things like that. But, from what I saw, yeah, I didn't observe a ton of that.
All right. We also really wanted to know, because, you put so much time and research into this whole concept. What do you, now having done this whole documentary, think are the big challenges for comic shop owners, and have they really changed over the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question and interesting for me, because it's like now it has been quite a few years since I worked at a shop. But I mean, as far as the challenges, on a day-to-day basis, there are, to run any small business, there are certain challenges that you're going to face. But, specifically in the comics industry, there are a number of challenges inherent to a comic shop, having to pre-order, having to order books two or 3 months in advance, relying on imperfect information, dealing with, shortages and damages, dealing with customers who don't pick up their books. I mean, I think those are, when you talk really about like the daily grind of a comic shop, and some of the, pet peeves that you tend to hear from retailers, I think those are some of the most common ones. And I've certainly saw a lot of that. I mean, as far as some of the bigger picture challenges, one of the things, and you saw it in the trailer there, we have artwork in there that kind of visually represents this, but this dichotomy between the popularity of comic book movies, which, make billions of dollars. And for the most part, you're not really seeing that reflected in the stores for the most part. It's not like all of these people who are going to the movies are suddenly flocking to shops to read about these characters in their original form. So, I mean, as far as like a bigger picture challenge, I mean, I think this is something that it always has been, which is, how do you grow the audience? How do you find new people? How do you get those people into the shops? What was encouraging was, there are a number of instances in the movie where you see, direct, tangible efforts that stores are taking to try to do something. And one thing that, immediately comes to mind that's in the film, All Yeah Comics right here in Harrison, which I know, Kara, you got to visit when they first opened, I think, right?
I stepped in. I was like, wait, the guys who do the cute comics now have a cute comic store and it's 10 minutes from my house. Yeah.
Exactly. But so they set up at the local Alamo Draft House whenever there's a big superhero movie, and they bring pops and trade paperbacks and things like that. So like that's a very specific step, a very proactive step that they're taking to try to catch people who are going to these movies and help kind of turn them into comic fans. So again, that was encouraging. And that's sort of, when we're talking about challenges, that was something that was a fine line to walk in the movie. I think we struck a nice balance. But, I didn't want to shy away from the realities of this, and it's a hard business and it's often not very glamorous. But at the same time, I didn't want this to be a doom and gloom look at the comics industry, because I don't think that's fair either. I mean, I think there are a lot of stores that are doing really interesting things. You have Amalgam Comics and Coffee House in Philadelphia. They're a coffee shop and a comic shop. Like, it's really a really interesting business model, and they're doing great things within their store and in their surrounding community with events and things like that. So, that was definitely a line to walk. But I mean, as far as challenges, I think those are some specific ones, and then like a really big picture one that I saw.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that, like, it seems like the onus is on the comic shops in order to drive customers, because unfortunately it seems like the publishers aren't really pushing that, especially when it comes to the big movies and stuff, like how bizarre would it be to see at the end of a film, like, and then go buy the comic this was based on and here's a list of comic shops in the local area or something. I realize that's maybe asking for a lot, but still, it's interesting to hear that the onus is really on the comic book shops to try to put themselves in front of customers, in front of people at maybe the movie theater or something like that, in order to draw people in to say, hey, you could read more Batman, you could read more X-Men.
Yeah, well,
that's interesting.
I'm so glad you mentioned all of that. Because that's a question that I've had, and I've explored that on the podcast too. It's like, when you look at the sort of the hierarchy in the industry, and who has the power and the resources, it's like, should it really be on the mom and pop comic shop to set up at the movie theater? But what I think the interesting thing is, publishers are doing things to try to grow the audience, right? Like, DC's whole Walmart thing. And, again, digital comics, of course, the fact that, DC is now on Comixology Unlimited and they have the app. So I think there are steps that are being taken at a higher level to try to get new people reading comics, but they're not necessarily steps designed to get someone to step foot in a comic shop, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned the Walmart thing, because I think that kind of frustrated both the internet and comic shops, I think, to a certain extent, to say, well, hold on, you're selling stuff that I can't get my hands on. Now, how am I supposed to, like, continue to sell comics to people? But yeah, I mean, I think that those are steps in the right direction to get comics in the hands of people, and it's like, where is it the value actually supposed to be set in? Is it in the comic book shops who have based their entire, organization around the ability to sell these things, or is it on the publishers who are just trying to get the comics in people's hands? Which I know you don't necessarily have the answer, because it's something that we've talked about on the show numerous times in the past, and I don't think anyone has the answer, because we all just want more people to read comic books, but at the same time, the local comic book shop is kind of the big thing, and it has been a big thing, since comic book shops have kind of shown up over the last 30, 40 years as being like comic book only shops. But at least it's at least it seems to me that like these shops aren't necessarily going anywhere, right? I mean, despite all of the the issues that you think you pointed out earlier, these shops aren't necessarily all failing. And in fact, I think more shops have opened in the last 2 years than they have in like the past decade or something. So at least it's good to hear that they aren't like all doom and gloom and worried that this is going to be it. 2020 is the last year, or 2019 or 2018 is the last year for us. Unless you did come across shops like that, I need to see the film in order to actually know that that's happening.
No, for the most part, yeah, no, I don't think there's, that degree of pessimism really, anywhere in the movie. I think, sort of hanging over all of this is the fact that, closure for, one store or many stores, is certainly a possibility. And that's why, we're talking about these challenges, in the movie. But yeah, no, that's certainly not the tone of the movie.
Gotcha. One of the other things I was curious about was if you noticed any, we kind of touched on this before, but if you noticed any trends on how like a shop was run based on how successful it was. Like, for instance, I know that there's a comic shop in Michigan called Vault Comics or Vault of Midnight, excuse me, and they have basically expanded from one branch in Ann Arbor to 2 more branches, one in Detroit, one in Grand Rapids. And to me, I think I used to shop there when I lived in Michigan, and so I think like their very welcoming atmosphere, their severe involvement in the community has helped them. Did you notice anything among the shops that you visited that were maybe doing a little bit better than other shops?
Yeah,
you visited?
That's the thing. And, going back to what you were saying before about, sort of how viable a living is it, to run a comic shop. And there is a range. And I mean, there are people in the movie who say like, we've just started to pay our bills. So it's not like they're necessarily drawing much from it, but now they're at least able to sustain it. Not so much said in the movie, but, I know there are stores that, a spouse works and is supporting it, or there's money coming in from elsewhere. It's kind of more of a, a hobby business as opposed to, something that's they're living off of. And then there are retailers in the movie who talk about like, I pay off, I own my car and I pay my rent. Like, they're living off of what they make at the store. But then there are shops. I mean, and this was, again, going back to some of the more positive aspects, there are stores that are very successful. And, a big part of the movie we spend on the high-end vintage back issue market, which was extremely eye-opening for me as I learned more about it. I mean, it's such big business. Torpedo Comics in Las Vegas and Metropolis Collectibles in New York. I mean, you see the operations that these that these outfits have, and the kinds of books that they're dealing, and the price tags on them, and it's astounding. So yeah, that's the thing. And then the other aspect too, I mean, there are so many variables in this. I mean, one is actually going back to geography, where in the country you are and the value of real estate, like, where Alternate Realities was, in Scarsdale in Westchester, New York, by the time the owner closed, his rent was about $7,000 a month for not a vast space. You go to some of these. Yeah. And, you go to some of these other stores in other parts of the country. I mean, I don't know exactly what they're paying in rent, but I know it's a fraction of what he was paying. And they have so much more space. I mean, there were a number of stores that rented the space next to them just to use for gaming or storage or things like that. So, their overhead is entirely different than what we faced at our store. So, there's that wrinkle too.
Interesting. I was going to ask, the community side of the thing seems to be something you mentioned early on in the show. For all the shops that you went to, did you notice that there were a handful of regulars? I don't know how much time you were able to spend at these shops, or did you happen to go in on Wednesday to kind of get a feel of what this store was like on its busiest day of the week? Or were you there just like on a weekend or something, and you kind of saw like, oh, these are regulars that already came in on Wednesday, but they're coming in again just to hang out? What was it like from shop to shop for you?
Yeah, so I was at certain stores on Wednesdays. Other stores were not, and that was partly by design to kind of just show, different different days of the week, but also just logistically in terms of when I was there. So that was kind of a mix. I can't say I was anywhere for a long enough period of time where I really saw the same people coming back. But yeah, I mean, you definitely got the sense, it's in the new trailer that just came out. But one of the first things I filmed was the Action Comics 1000 midnight release at Acme Comics in North Carolina. Right. And I mean, people who were there, like that's their that's their regular crowd. And actually, I think I did see a few of them the next day, because I did that Tuesday night release, and then I was there the next day. So you definitely got to see that. But it's, even if I wasn't there multiple days, I mean, just sort of the instant recognition and the conversations that would spring up in these stores. I mean, you definitely got the sense that these were, this was a regular part of their routine.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's interesting.
So did you find your new comic shop anywhere in the U.S.? Or are you still looking?
I knew that was coming. I knew that question was coming, and I was thinking about it. At the end of the day, no. Like no. I don't think any store ever could replace alternate realities in my heart. And it would be unfair to ask any other store to do that. I mean, the formative, high school, college, like those were such formative years. And, being there as an employee, and a customer, again, it's so near and dear to me. That being said, and I don't say this at the expense of any of the stores, but I will give a couple of shout outs. There were a couple of stores where I guess I felt most at home. One was Fat Moose Comics in Whippany, New Jersey. That shop, and I was there on a Wednesday, and their gathering of their after work crowd, and just sort of the vibe in the store was probably the closest that I've seen that kind of reminded me of alternate realities. So that was very nice. And then Acme Comics was probably the other one that, was not so much the same atmosphere, but in terms of, again, like those regular faces and just the sense of community that you felt there. So the manager of that store is Lord Retail. Now we won't go down an alternate realities rabbit hole, but Kara knows. Yeah, well, all right, we can. But Kara knows. The owner of Alternate Realities was Steve Odo, and he was, kind of a larger than life character. He lived by a set of Odoisms, as he called them, and he would refer to himself in the third person. And he was, he is a very eccentric character, and exactly what you would want, I think, in a retailer. And so Lord Retail, very different approach, but even just his nickname. I mean, he's this grand nickname. He has, a very distinct aesthetic that he wears his fedora and his vest. So like that aspect, I really gravitated toward. I love, I mean, all the retailers have their own personalities, but especially when we kind of get into that, larger than life, like character. I love that. So I definitely felt at home at Acme.
Okay. I am going to hard left all of us into an alternate realities rabbit hole because
But I know nothing about this shop. You guys, I feel like you guys have talked about it, but as someone who wasn't there, what made you guys love this shop so much?
So,
I gotta
Anthony,
know.
You should know that I regularly reference alternate realities to our listeners, and it's always in like very short, brief terms of like my LCS RIP. Like it's still my LCS.
Right,
so
right.
Let's paint a picture for our listeners about alternate realities, the formative years of comic books for both Kara and our guest Anthony. I'll steal a line that I used in your documentary that one time. Like walking into alternate realities was like instantly I knew it was my comic book soulmate situation. Like there's just like these. It was like walking into kind of like this small cave of wonders, but everything's cardboard. Like there's just boxes everywhere, like floor to ceiling, like action figures that have been sitting on the shelf for like 5 years. Like the whole back of the shop and the side of the shop is like statues behind glass, and then there's like floppies on the right side when you walk in by this like elevated register situation where there's always at least like 3 dudes hanging out. Like, ooh, it was a lot.
Yeah, it's so funny because the things that you cite, as things that you loved about the store, for some of us, they were, kind of frustrations, the fact that there, and I guess there's a fine line between, like, cluttered and, I don't know, like a more lived in feel.
Like you said, it was a small space. There was no room. So maximizing the floor space. Everyone in New York has to do this at some point in their lives. This is just reality.
True. But no, that's the thing, so again, I think, we would have always liked a little less clutter, but, we've heard, you just said it now, we've heard from other customers who kind of liked that. And it gave it that like cozy feel and, an opportunity for discovery to search through things. So yeah, it definitely, like, there was a lot of stuff, like there was always something, to look through. And, no matter how many times you were there, and, you were there regularly, but like, on a weekly basis? Like for those of us who were there multiple days per week, we were still always looking through stuff. So, there was something to be said for that.
I'm so flattered you think I was there weekly. It would be months between I would come to pick up my pull list. I'm one of those people. Yes, I was one of those people. Steve knew I was good for the money every time, but sometimes it would be 3 months before I could get to the shop. Because when I was a teenager, I was relying on my parents for rides, and they're not exactly thrilled about me spending like $50, $60, $70, $100 every time I'm going in the shop. They're like, do you need these things, Kara? Do you really? So,
and the answer is yes.
It was enough to like get them to drive me there. So sometimes it would be, college, I made it more frequently. There was that time I was fun employed for a while. That's the weekly time. That's when I was making cookies for everybody.
Oh, see, I guess that's what made the biggest impression on me. And then now in my head, I'm like, oh, she was there all the time.
That was when I didn't have anything else going on because I literally could not find a job. But,
I see.
Everyone had that moment. But yeah, like for me, being in the shop was really about kind of having a place to go where like everything was great in terms of like, high school, you're kind of figuring out your whole deal. And part of me figuring out my whole deal was like getting way too into the Teen Titans. And that's how I found the shop in the first place. Because I was like, I need more Teen Titans. What do you mean they're comic books also, not just a television show? And then I ended up like bringing all my friends, and I got one of my friends, like she turned into like a serious Green Lantern junkie. Like she bought more books than I did. So, and we would just like, she and I would sit in the aisle and somehow not get kicked out of the shop. We would just like sit down for a couple hours and just gossip and just like be in our own little world. And like the shop was fine with that to an extent, I guess. So
you weren't bothering anybody, right?
It was fine. And then, so Anthony, you mentioned briefly Steve Odo, the owner of the store, and his Odoisms, and I actually wrote down my favorite one in the notes prepping for this episode here right now, which is everything sells eventually. And I just remember, like I was looking at their like action figures that had been there for a million years, kind of by the front door, and there's this like, I forget if it was Flipper or like a different dolphin, but there's like this little plastic dolphin in the original packaging. And I'm like, Steve, why do you even have this? Like, what are you going to do with this? And he's like, everything sells eventually. And like, I had been seeing that dolphin for like 8 years, I swear to God. And the next time I came in, Steve was like, the dolphin sold. So I was like, okay, all right, everything sells eventually. Got it. Log that one away.
I mean, he's still living by that, and everyone will see in the documentary, he took all of the remaining merch when the store closed. He took all of the remaining merchandise, and they're now stored in these vast storage units, and you get to see them in the documentary, and he has it set up like the store.
I'm gonna cry.
Oh, no way.
Oh no.
Which, again, I'm always curious to know how people, what people's take on that is, and it's for them to, decide. But yeah, the whole like everything eventually sells. I don't know. That can kind of cut both ways. I don't know if that's always the right outlook.
When is eventually?
But exactly what you said. Like, and that I think honestly was the same thing for me with alternate realities, and why. I think that this move, I know, this is a comic centric podcast, and hopefully, I'm assuming comics fans listening to this, but
we're all nerds.
It was really,
go on.
Yeah.
But,
don't worry about it.
But, for me, like, it was important with this documentary. Like, I wanted it to do justice to people who are in this and know it, whether you're a customer, collector, or a retailer, or a creator, or a publisher. Like, I wanted it to be legitimate and a fair take on the industry. But it was also important to me. I want to reach people beyond, just the comics industry. And I think this whole idea of community and having this place and the face-to-face interactions I think that's what people, that's what resonates with people. And I've seen that at various festival screenings for the movie. That's, I think, what is able to draw people in. But specifically with alternate realities, like, yeah, like it was the same thing for me, especially those high school and college years. Like, I didn't have other people in my life who were into comics. And so, like, to go to that store, and all of a sudden, like, have people to talk to about this, like, it really meant a lot. And then, once I started working there and I was surrounded by all this stuff all the time, it was, I could not have asked for more. So that's why, like, again, I don't think it's fair to ask any other store to replicate that type of experience for me, because it was so formative. I don't think anything could.
Can I tell you one of my favorite days at the shop ever?
Yes.
One of my favorite days at the shop ever was, I think it was like a weekend or a long weekend, and Steve was out of town, and like you and the other employees had conspired to just have a mega sale on everything without him knowing. I lost my mind. I was like, 50% off statues, I'm buying 5 of them. 50% off trades, I'm buying 10. I spent so much money that day. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I bought, I was looking at this like tiny, like half statue of Admiral Akbar from Star Wars. And I was with my friend who I dragged into all this nonsense with me. And I was like, I don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it. I'm not buying it. I don't need it. And she's like, Kara, you have literally been looking at this statue for like 5 years now. It's 50% off. It's now or never. I was like, no, but like, I don't need it. I'm buying all these other statues. And she was like, for fuck's sake, it's $25. I'll buy it for you. And she did. And that's like the one thing I have with me throughout all of like my moves and travels and different jobs. I just like Admiral Akbar's on my desk reminding me eternally, A, it's a trap, and B, your friends love you, and C, buy the fucking statue. Like,
No, that's awesome. And I got to tell you, like I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, those were they didn't happen all that often, but when Steve would go out of town and let us mind the shop, those were some of our favorite times too. Again, going back. Yeah, no, of course. And, but it's funny because going back to this whole thing of like, just the approach to the business and everything eventually sells, if there was one tension ever, in the store, I think it was that. Like, I think for those of us, some of the former owners and those of us who work there, I think we wanted to move product more. If Steve got a new collection in, he would want to kind of hold on to it for a while. Whereas we would try to push him to be like, no, like, you got to price these and get them out. And then similarly with, some of the, the overstock and things that kind of had their day and then we're just sitting there, a lot of us were kind of always of the opinion. It's like, hey, like, discount it, move it, get it out, get something new in there, rotate things. Whereas Steve was more of that it'll eventually sell mentality. But yeah, when we had our opportunities, when he would go away, we would do what we could. And he mostly knew what we were doing. We weren't doing anything, really that we shouldn't have been. But I will say, it might have been that time or it might have been one of the others. Bill Mayo, one of my former coworkers there, we made up a sign that said, and maybe, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a sign that said like the make me an offer, Steve's out of town sale. And we hid it, and we had the sign up while he was away, and then we hid the sign because again, there was so much stuff buried all the time, and he and I were like, you know what, one day Steve will find this, and we'll all have a laugh. And we've stuck it in a box, and sure enough, and I have the photo, I can send it to you. I've posted it on Facebook a while back. Oh my God. Sure enough, like one Wednesday, I happened to be there, and Steve found it. It was great, and I'll send you the photo because his expression is priceless.
Oh, incredible! Oh man,
fantastic.
I think there was a former store regular who then moved to Arizona, like somewhere in the Southwest, and was in town for one of those sales. And I distinctly remember having a moment where I was like, I'm going to get in a fight with this guy if he doesn't give me that poison ivy statue right now. There was like one last poison ivy statue and I really wanted it. And he had it in his hands. And I think I must have looked like I was about to commit murder because he was like, you take it. like those sales were real.
I'm curious, Anthony. You said you brought up this idea that you'd get a collection into the shop and then you'd hold on to it. Did you find that maybe some of the other shops that you talked to also did things like that, where they'd be like, "Oh, look, we've got this whole run, or we've got this special edition comic or something that's slated or blocked or whatever you call it," and they just didn't want to get rid of it. They wanted to kind of show it off as like a piece to just say, "Hey, look, we've got this," and maybe you'll buy something else while you're here.
I did not get that sense, at least from the stores that I went to.
Okay.
Again, it might be a factor, but not that I particularly noticed. I mean, if anything, I got the sense the retailers I spoke to were a bit more mindful of not falling into that trap and of having that separation. Because that's another interesting thing about the comics industry and with comic shops, where in virtually every instance, I mean, the person running the store is a fan. And so you kind of have to divorce yourself from that. And that can be really hard. And I think, at Alternate Realities, I think that was definitely, I mean, he has admitted it as much, for Steve, that, he approached a lot of it as a collector. And so he didn't want to part with things. He wanted to have them. And, when you're running a business, that's, that can be
problematic,
in a difficult situation.
Right. I was going to say, I mean, you got to think that as a fan, you maybe go, well, I'm going to maybe buy this for myself, even though I just got it from somewhere else. But eventually you run out of space, and as we all do as comic book fans.
That's the thing. I know it's really the space, I think. I mean, the money, of course, but it's the space.
But yeah, I guess, Kara, I don't know. Do you have any last final questions you wanted to get out before we wrap things up?
I did. I do have. I have a terrible, horrible question for everyone involved in this chat right now.
Oh no.
If you were to open a comic shop today, but you can only stock 5 books, what are those 5 books?
Oh, brother. I mean, you got to go with it in 2 ways, right? You pick your favorites that you really like, or you pick the ones that you know are going to sell. So you just pick X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman, Superman.
Favorites. The ones you feel passionately about, because if you're passionate enough about them, you can convince other people to like them too.
Listen, I'm just trying to make money here, Kara.
No, somebody's gonna like one of those 5 books you like.
I'm with Mike on this. I don't want to, not to team up against you, but I think you got to go with like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, X. Like, I don't know, you got to go with the heavy hitters.
Okay.
You go with the heavy hitters, but then you leave your 5th spot for something that you truly love and cherish. And I think
are capitalist cynics. Okay, I'll go first. I'm doing Superman Birthright because it's the only Superman book that matters.
Okay. Am I with you? I'm with you. Not that it's the only one that matters, but it's the only origin story that matters. I'll give you that.
Yeah. I feel very strongly about Superman Birthright. Huge fan, actually, of Selena's big score. It's a Catwoman story that Darwin Cook did, where she's like not actually in costume. It's like her as Selena Kyle doing this like retro James Bondy heist, and I find myself returning to it over and over again, and I'm just like, oh, why is this book so good? All right, I should probably pick something from Marvel. So, Moon Knight, that Moon Knight run from a couple years ago, where everything was like minimal dialogue and really intense colors. I feel that's yeah. I feel like that's a really accessible book. I'm so sorry to the creative team. I'm like blanking on it right now. Jordy Belair did colors, all right?
Yeah, it was like Jeff Lemire, I think, and then they swapped artists between Francesco Francavilla and Greg Smallwood, I think. And Jordy Belair did all the colors because she's fucking incredible. Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
No, that was pretty wild. All right, so that's 3. I should probably do some non-big 2 books, shouldn't I?
I mean, yeah, it's your store.
It is my store. Okay. Let me think. Gonna go with a more like all ages situation. I'm torn between Lumberjanes and Nimona, and my 5th spot is absolutely Giant Days. I will make everyone read Giant Days if it kills me.
I love it. Okay. I think I've got it. So my comic shop only sells very short, limited run books, and also manga, because that's something that actually that we didn't get a chance to touch on. And Anthony, maybe we could have you back on the show just to talk about manga in comic shops, because I'm really curious about that as well. But I think I sell My Hero Academia, X-Men Legacy. That's the Simon Spurrier run that I love to death. We only have copies of Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me because I love that book to death. We sell. I'm looking at my bookshelf as I'm trying to do this. We also sell Zero by Alice Scott and the 18 various artists that he did with that book.
Ooh,
and
yeah.
I feel like I got to pick another X-Men book, but I think that I would go with Tom King's Batman run, just because I really liked it, and it's the only full Batman run that I really read.
All right, that's fair. That's a heavy hitter right there. That's going to be your that's going to keep the lights on while you try to sell everything else.
Exactly. So, Anthony, we've tried to give you some time. Do you have any thoughts on what your 5 could be?
Yes, I know. I'd be like, what can I? So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to divorce, like, what I think would sell versus, like, what I'm truly passionate about. But I'll go with, like, some of my all-time favorites. And this will be a very DC-heavy list.
Sure.
I'll go with a different Darwin Cook selection, New Frontier.
Ooh,
yeah.
Okay. So we're definitely going to go with that. Again, keeping in the DC realm, one of my all-time favorites, Gotham Central.
Oh, such a good book. So underrated.
That?
Oh.
And I mean, and that's something like you want to talk about a book that could potentially get someone who's not into comics. I mean, I think that's a perfect entry point for someone.
Totally.
Let's see. Well, still technically DC, but not superheroes. One of my all-time favorite series, Why the Last Man. We gotta include that.
Nice.
Being turned into a show. You've got your crossover marketing right there.
Yeah, you're done, man.
Yeah.
You're good.
I know. All right, I'll do something Marvel. As much as I'm a DC fan, like, I mean, there is some Marvel that I really like. Spider-Man and Daredevil are among my favorite characters in all of comics. I guess I'd be kind of torn between like Spider-Man Blue. I mean, that's one specific story versus like the Bendis Daredevil run. That's really up there for me.
Oh yeah, see, you're good. Your comic shop's gonna sell way more than mine. I can already tell you that. But
so we'll go with Bendis Daredevil because that has multiple volumes. We can sell more. And then
listen, I picked My Hero Academia because you know what? That book is never gonna stop.
Very smart. And then, I mean, all right, so for number 5, I mean, Superman's my all-time favorite character. And I got to go with Birthright as well. It's my favorite telling of the origin. And I got to say, so Mark Waid is in the documentary, and getting to meet him and interview him for that was very, very cool.
Yeah, I realized we didn't touch on a lot of aspects, but that really blew my mind when I saw him for a moment in the trailer. I was like, "Whoa, this is super cool."
One time, I had an opportunity to interview Gail Simone, and it was a trash fire because the entire time I was just like, "I love your work so much. You are the best. Please let me explain to you exactly how formative you were as me as a comic reader." So, like, I hope you were more professional than I was when I did that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it went well, but it was funny. So I, like, for all of the interviews, I mean, I would jot down notes ahead of time, but some I didn't need to do as much prep as others. But with Wade, like, I over prepared because I was like, in case I just get so nervous, like, I can just read what I have.
Yeah.
But everything went well, but it was really funny. So my wife was with me for virtually all of the filming, and she did say after that one, she was like, I could tell you were a little nervous. But I was like, he's one of my all-time favorite writers, and again, Superman Birthright's my favorite Superman origin story. But he was wonderful, and honestly, like, having him in the movie, Paul Levitz is in the movie as well.
Oh, nice.
And it's like, having these people. I mean, it's wonderful having all of the retailers, but getting people, from the creative side and the publishing side, I think adds, even more legitimacy to this. So that was important to me. I wanted to try to represent those perspectives too, and I was honored that they were, willing to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I guess we should probably wrap up here, unless Carrie, you had some final thoughts here.
I could talk about all of this all day, so just stop me now.
Of course. Okay, well, I guess before we leave, Anthony, if folks want to follow you and follow up more on this documentary after they see it and they've got burning questions, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, so on social media, it's My Comic Shop Country on Facebook, My Comic Shop Country Movie on Instagram, and My Comic Shop Doc on Twitter. And then the podcast is My Comic Shop History, and that's on Apple Podcasts and most major podcast platforms. And then the movie itself, My Comic Shop Country, is available to rent or purchase on Apple TV and Amazon.
Awesome. Well, everyone, you should go out there, grab a copy of this movie, watch it, and then send your burning questions over to Anthony on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you do things. Anthony, this was so fantastic. My Comic Shop Country is out on April 7th, 2020. So when this episode airs, you'll already be able to go buy it and check it out. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony. This is great.
Thank you. Really, thank you both. I really had a great time. It was wonderful. It was great catching up and reminiscing about alternate realities, and it was great meeting you, Mike, and having this chat. Yeah. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow Kara at KaraSSam. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we post all sorts of things. We're also on Instagram at IRCB Podcast. You know all of this.
This show and our many subscriber-only episodes, including Saga of Saga happening now, are powered by fans like you on Patreon. Join now at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. And if you haven't already, please rate and review our show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Make sure you join us on Discord for hangouts and just general cool times. We play D&D sometimes. If that's a thing you're into, we do that over there. That's over at ircbpodcast.com/Discord. Make sure to tell a friend or two about the show as well. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all the music for our show. We can't thank them enough for letting us use their music. Xander is a high wizard, a great guy, and he edits the show. I want to say thank you to Anthony and Kara for being on this episode. Thank you to all the listeners out there. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.